Hello, this is Valerie Moore from the Frederian Gazette. We wish you a happy Pride and thank you for joining us this warm Wednesday evening as we reenact the controversial book Say I Slew Them Not, written by Kingsley, edited by Alexander Phillips, and narrated by Pepper Halloway. If you've enjoyed our program so far and want to contribute to 3 lesbians in a recording booth, please donate to our Ko-Fi at www.ko-fi.com/The Gazette. Content warnings for this episode include colonial violence, forced resettlement, police violence and brutality, references to torture and assassinations, death by immolation, violent arrests. This program has been sponsored by Mycroft's Jewelry and Engraving. Trying to find the perfect gift for your loved ones? Visit Mycroft's Jewelry in Appleburg and find that one-of-a-kind diamond or that special emerald and sapphire necklace your special someone deserves. We now pass the mic to Pepper Halloway, who will be reading Episode 11. Ilkhatal President Cathal Galloway calls Heva's proposal to close the Hevian-Killbra border a grave mistake that will exasperate already high tensions. December 12th, 1826, 5th Avenue, Ilkhatal Tenements, Berkassa, Heva. After weeks of planning, organizing, and practicing, Griffin wasn't even in the damn carriage. It was a last-minute change, the type that often saved her life. If only her luck had failed her that snowy day in October, so many lives would have been spared. Griffin, in typical Hevian fashion, responded with thoughtless brutality. She arrested 3 Ilkhatal who didn't even fit our description, tortured them for 5 days, and executed them by firing squad without trial before displaying them on Lamass Street. A phoenix studying poverty in an Ilkhatal neighborhood stumbled upon the bodies and published an alarmed account in a local newspaper. Quentin followed up with the Phoenix and published an article about the murders, and within 2 weeks it was circulating across the continent as a headline in all the national newspapers. President Smith, still trying to repair Heva's reputation after the Ardashir affair, immediately reassigned Griffin to Killbra, while the chamber planned a new legislative horror for my people. "We shall not be frightened by these barbarians," read Devon, dropping his voice to impersonate the Hevian president. "We shall not cower before their wave of terror and brutality. We shall restore peace and order to Heva." "All right, Dev, enough," said Siegfried, sitting on the floor of his new cramped room in the tenement on 5th Avenue, courtesy of the Hevians. "Wait, this is the best part," said Devon, reading from a Frederian newspaper. President Ichabod Smith went on to say, "The latest butchery conducted by the ILA forced the chambers and myself to enact the Segregation Act. This bill will keep our communities safe by moving all Ilkhatal into their own district. They will be given a passport granting them access to non-segregated areas only on account of employment." "At least they can still work us to death," muttered Asia, lying on several blankets and coats on the floor. We gathered in a dark, rat-infested, cockroach-filled, freezing hole in the wall, one of the many in our crumbling new home. Devon, Gary, and I were living in an even smaller room next door. "Hang on, this is what I wanted to show you," said Devon, getting to the end of the article. The bill passed with an overwhelming majority, 185 yeas and 15 nays, on November 2nd. The police began the segregation process on November 4th, moving the Ilkhatal to a dilapidated district in Berkassa. Sebastian Wallace, a presidential hopeful and former Unionist-turned-Plumet member, led the opposition, arguing that, quote, "segregating the Ickies further won't solve the crisis, but only feed the flames. We've concentrated the terrorists with a peaceful majority, allowing the ILA to recruit new members with ease. The Unionists have once again made the wrong decision and have placed this country one step closer to civil war." Honorable Wallace only recently supported the Ilkhatal cause in stark opposition to his former fellow Unionist member, Patrick McAllister, another presidential hopeful. "What we have done is regretful, but we cannot allow the ILA free rein in Heva," said McAllister. "We trust our Ilkhatal brethren and hope they'll come forth with the names of these terrorists and end this nonsense." "Goddamn bastards," said Ernest, sitting next to Asia and holding her hand with her bright, multicolored nails. Devon continued. While many Unionist members have closed ranks around McAllister, supporting his harsh Ilkhatal policies and his bid for the presidency, Others have grumbled that McAllister's quarrel with Sebastian Wallace has jeopardized the Unionists' electoral chances. It's irresponsible is what it is, said a staffer who wished to remain anonymous. Letting their own egos rupture the party right before McAllister announces his plans to handle the Ilkhatal problem. So far, Wallace is the only one to jump ship, but we could lose several key members if McAllister's policies fail to curb the Ilkhatal. If that happens, and the voters gift McAllister of a Hun Chambers, we'll be in deep trouble. That was fascinating, Dev, said Siegfried, rubbing his forehead. But what's the point? The reporter is the point. Quentin Jacoby, he'd be on our side. My ears perked up as I barely recognized the name. On our side? What do you mean? Asked Ernest. We could get him to write articles for us. He's interested in presenting our side. He went through all that trouble to check the legality of the stupid separation thing. He broke the story about the executions, and he's been asking around for us. Asking for us? Asked Siegfried, his ears jumping in concern. He's the reporter, I said, snapping and hopping up from my corner. What are you two talking about? Asked Asia. I explained what Sandy and I had discussed the night of Asia's attack. Did Sandy say if we could trust him or not? Asked Siegfried, scratching his snout. He wasn't sure. He was going to have one of Frank's men interrogate him, but... I glanced at Asia, who looked down as Ernest held her closer and nuzzled her snout. Keynes or I could do it, said Devon. If we think we can trust him, then we'll give him our blessing and we can tell him our tale. Siegfried abruptly rose. Let me talk to Sandy and Gary first. We have to be careful. Even with the butcher gone. He trailed off as he walked out the door. A shadow crossed Devon's face as he watched my cousin leave, and desperate for a change of subject, I asked Asia how she was feeling. I'm okay, she said stubbornly. Karen and Dad just overworry as a hobby. Speaking of your father, said Devon with a forced, mischievous grin, the two of you living with him. That's gotta be awkward. He's sort of given us his approval, said Ernest, a sheepish smile crawling across his ear snout. I told you would grow on him, Asia said. I had to assassinate someone. She shrugged. Never said he was sane. Does Sandy let you sleep next to her, or are you banished to the corner? Devon poked. Aye, get your mind out of the sewers, Devon Tosser, scoffed Asia, throwing one of her shoes at him, while Ernest looked down in great embarrassment. What about ya? What are you going to do with your 50 partners? I'll visit them in their rooms, and who knows, might convince their roommates to join in. Devon grinned. It's going to be harder to escape their partners, though, I said. One must risk everything for true love, Devon replied. Besides, why do you assume they wouldn't want to join us? All right, Dev, you need to go, said Asia. Right, you don't have long until Siegfried and Sandy returns, grinned Devon, causing Ernest to look like Z had swallowed a fly, and Asia failed to hide her smile. Hope she's not a screamer, Devon called as we left their room. These walls seem pretty thin. He laughed as Asia threw her other shoe at him, and we walked down the crowded and filthy hallway into our cramped and faintly lit room. A lone candle resting on the stove in the corner of the room revealed Gary and a teeny child wearing nothing but pants that were 10 times too big for him, suspenders, and a large newsboy cap that fell over his pale, furry ears, his teeny horns barely poking through the fabric. Oh, said Gary, his ears lowering when he spotted us. I wasn't expecting you to return so soon. Who's the pipsqueak? Devon asked, recovering from his surprise faster than I did. Hey, who are you calling pipsqueak, punk? I may be small, but at least I don't have club fingers. Aye, behave, threatened Gary, and the spunky young Ilkhatal lowered his bushy ears but kept his tough exterior. Who is he? I asked. His name is Pip, him, and he's gonna be staying with us. For how long? Asked Devon, as the boy sized him up. Indefinitely, muttered Gary. Why? I asked. Because he done adopted me, said Pip, puffing his chest out and looking at me defiantly. Devon laughed. Why would he do something so stupid? It's a long story, sighed Gary, sending Pip to a corner before approaching us and whispering, "Is either adopt him or kill him." What? I asked. The jackass has been stealing from Griffin because he can. When he asked to join us, I said no because he's too young. So he started to steal from us. Sandy caught him and almost executed him before I intervened, promising to be responsible for him. So now he's mine. You're going to mentor him? Said Devon, and it was clear we were thinking the same thing. Gary could barely look after himself on a good day, let alone a small child. Do either you want him? He snapped with a growl, and we earnestly shook our heads. Well, Devon attempted, at least we have our first piece of furniture. July 6, 1827, Ilkhatal tenements, Berkassa, Heva. It is easy to look back and identify where someone, quote-unquote, went wrong, and wonder how anyone could ever have made such an obvious mistake. At the time, forming a partnership with the IFM seemed natural. We were both fighting for Ilkhatal independence, believed that Hevians only responded to violence, and had a vendetta against that bastard Griffin. We should have known better. We were blinded by our grief over Asia's attack, our excitement at creating an empire-wide revolution, and eager to learn from our fellow rebels. We refused to see the signs that Marcus wasn't interested in a partnership, but a consolidation. It took us 6 months to smuggle Marcus and his 2 comrades across the border into a safe house directly under Griffin's nose. Another month before they could meet us in a muddy basement in Berkassa. They marched into that basement as if they owned the entire city, Marcus, he, him, front and center of his 2 comrades, Margaret and Sean Leland, flanking him as self-appointed bodyguards. They all wore the black frocks of the Alanist faith, God's golden eye hanging from their throats. Siegfried hushed us and invited Marcus to take center stage, Devon elbowing me and whispering, "He's huge." Marcus was one of a kind. He was reminiscent of the ginormous statues the Vistritz carved to honor their dead. His wide shoulders seemed cut from marble, and his collar strained against his thick neck. He was a protective being carved by the Mariatich themselves to represent everything indomitable about the Ilkhatal spirit, including the ability to rediscover and embrace our true heritage. Like many trans Ilkhatal, he grafted 3 inches of extra bone to his short horns with a metal clamp. They pointed forward like a bull, and he was riding out the awkward new growth of hair on his long ears. All of us, even Sandy, although he would later deny it, watched him in awe. "Like ya, I'm an Ilkhatal dedicated to our people," said Marcus, his voice crackled like gunpowder. "My second in command, Carrie McNair, he, they, and I took over the IFM in 1817, and we've turned it into Heva's bane. I'm here today to help you do the same and to learn all I can about this bitch, the butcher of Ilkhatal. We came close to killing her many times," Gary bragged. "And failed every single time," Margaret countered, and both Marcus and Siegfried gestured for peace. "Forgive, my comrade," said Marcus. "We are not known for our attack in Killbra. We want to know how she escaped justice. But first, my 2 comrades. This is Sean Leland, he, him, our financial officer." He gestured to an Ilkhatal that bore a startling resemblance to an anglerfish, lean, ugly, and with dull, wide-set eyes. His chipped, brownish-green scales grew in a rare, overlaying pattern that led to jagged edges along the snout and jawline. He filed his twisting horns and the 2 rows of spikes that ran down either side of his narrow snout. "This is Margaret, she, her, our weapons expert. She's responsible for our agreements with the Indariums and the occasional Vistruk." Even though she wasn't as tall as Marcus, she still towered over everyone else in the room, and like Amy, had enough muscles to subdue a minotaur. There weren't any spikes along her wide and flat snout, but she had clusters of spikes in the corner of her eyes, a common feature for those Ilkhatal who lived close to the poison rivers of Killbra. Her horns were short but sharp nubs, and she seemed to have grown out and sharpened her claws to make up for her lack of intimidating horns. Most surprisingly, she was pregnant. "I'm lending them to you to use as you see fit." Lending. Such an innocent word, one we accept without question. While I do not doubt Marcus's intentions were pure, it was clear that Sean and Margaret didn't think highly of us. We expected a partnership, but they saw a chance to expand the IFM's reach into Heva. "Carrie and I picked them specifically because they are our most reliable officers. They've seen what it takes to turn a passion for our people's liberation into a true revolution." Margaret, anything to add? "Rumor has it you get your weapons from local smugglers. It's better to get the weapons from the source. That way you'll have complete control over the supply chain. We work primarily with 2 contacts in the Idnis," said Margaret with immense pride. "I'll introduce you to them once we're ready. The condition of the weapons is generally good, and they're sympathetic to our cause. We receive considerable funding from a certain Indarium prince," said Sean, his voice slow and thick like molasses. "But our main source of income comes from the Hevians themselves. We have several key employees in the banks and exchange offices who know how to manipulate their profits so they don't notice the small amount we steal. When that fails, we rely on a national loan, mostly made of bonds that our people pay into. We'll teach you how to do that in Heva as well. The door burst open, and Pip tumbled in. "They're coming!" An electric shock traveled throughout the room as Sandy pulled the front door shut and the rest drew their revolvers. "There's a back door," I explained, "behind Devon." "Pip!" shouted Gary, pulling the young Ilkhatal to his side. "Stay with me," commanded Marcus, positioning himself behind a box that faced the entrance. "Help me hold them off while the others escape." "No," Sean said. "Siegfried, get Marcus out of here. If they find him, they'll execute him. I'll stay behind and hold the Hevians off." "Not alone," said Ernest. "Then I'm staying too," said Asia. "Ernest, Sean, Asia, follow us immediately after. Everyone else, move!" shouted Siegfried. Asia and Ernest positioned themselves behind a knocked-over table while everyone else ran out of the room, Sandy bringing up the rear. Gunfire and smoke clung to our backs as we crashed through the warm rain and humid wet breeze into a dirty, sunken alleyway. The alleyway was accessible by a flight of stairs and a tunnel that eventually led to street level. Margaret, Siegfried, and Marcus fired their revolvers at the police officers swarming down the stairs. I pulled Devon down the dark, slick underpass, Gary and Pip leading the way. Gunfire echoed around us, and we mentally grasped onto the faint light at the end of the tunnel, our only hope. Just out of the tunnel, across a road, and into Destitute Square, several blocks filled with tents and those Ilkhatal who couldn't get into tenements. A horrible move, as the police barely needed an excuse to harass the poor, but sometimes we had to take advantage of their basest of instincts to escape torture and hanging in a police station. Chimes as we emerged from the dark tunnel. Curfew. Pounding rain tormented my spinning mind as we splashed through great puddles that formed in the center of the road. Gary grabbed a struggling Pip and threw him over his shoulders as he dashed through the wet, sloping tents. Most were nothing more than a sheet or haphazardly patched scraps of discarded cloth. Devon apologized as we ran past, confused Ilkhatal and a family trying to start a fire with broken and wet pieces of furniture. "Watch it! Hurry, get away! Watch where you're going!" Gary and Pip were long gone, and I lost track of Devon as we parted to run around 3 tents clustered together. He would be fine, I told myself, my heart in my throat as I whirled around a woman and her child, nearly tripping over my 2 feet as my momentum carried me forward. We all knew to head to the tenement on the corner. It belonged to one of Devon's lovers. I can't remember which one anymore. Random gunfire echoed behind me, and for a moment I thought about whirling around and defending those who couldn't defend themselves. How often had our most destitute and helpless been abandoned to the cops and their billy clubs? What could those without weapons do when faced with so much rage and power, except the inevitable, like a sandcastle resisting a tidal wave? Something changed that night. A current ran through the camp as if they knew who we were and what would happen if the police found us, and they rose as one, shouting at the police to leave them alone.
Get out of here, rats!
The children were forced towards the center, far from the police, as everyone else linked arms and stood together, daring the police to try and take what was theirs. As much as I yearned to stand with those brave Ilkhatal, I knew I couldn't. No point in needlessly getting myself killed, or worse, arrested. I sheathed my revolver and ran, pushing through the surging Ilkhatal, careful to avoid the patched and waterlogged tents and sputtering fires, flinching at the first crack of gunfire and the screams that followed. Fucking bastards. There were entire families that would be brutalized tonight. Children turned into orphans and partners parted because the heartless Hevians were always content to harm the defenseless whenever they could. I forced myself forward, tears blurring my vision as the cracking of bones and gunfire followed me out of the camp and down a dark and lonely street. I gave thanks to the broken street lamps, as Hevian eyesight is notoriously poor in the dark, and quickly counted the blocks. I should have been close. Maybe the next building?
Ugh.
I choked as someone pulled me into a dark room by the collar. A door snapped shut as I laid flat against the wall, hardly daring to breathe as I struggled to identify my rescuer. "I'm Barris, you look beat, Kings," chirped Pip. Gary and Pip were alive and free! I asked for Devon, but neither knew what had happened to him or the others. We spent the night in the tenement, joining a trio of young chimney-sweeping Ilkhatal on the stairs, and Gary and I took turns being lookouts. Devon never joined us that night. I wanted to look for him, but calls for help distracted us and woke up the entire block. The tenement streamed into the streets, stopped short by the raging fire that had been the homeless camp. Quick-thinking Cathal tried to smother the fire by prying out the bricks that made the road and throwing specks of dirt. The three of us spent all night helping, Siegfried and Marcus joining us later in the morning. We ran into Margaret when we reached the other side of the camp. That must have been midday, but saw no sign of the others for hours. As the sun set on the still smoking destruction, we succumbed to the fear that the worst had happened to some of our dearest friends. You've just heard Ilkhatal President Marcus Galloway calls Heva's proposal to close the Hevian-Killbra border, quote, a grave mistake that will exasperate already high tensions, from Say I Sue Them Not by Kingsley Montevello. Tonight's episode was read by Pepper Holloway and was sponsored by Mycroft's Jewelry and Engraving. Surprise your special someone with a gift from a master craftsman. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and Blue Sky at Frederian Gazette, and go to our website, www.thefrederiangazette.com, for episode extras. Join us next Wednesday at 5 p.m. for episode 12. Honorable Lyle Birdwin urges Hevian president to call in the army to deal with Ilkhatal protesting Kingsley's trial.